So, Sarah and Ted, would you like to get started?
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Right, am I standing in the right place? Yes,
Yes.
I think I am.
Yes.
Right.
You can see yourself, you are.
I can see myself, yes. Well, good morning, everyone. I should say at the outset the stage that this research has reached. So Ted and I have prepared a draft report for the LEO project on policy and regulation. And that is at the moment being reviewed by colleagues there. So it is at the review stage. So please see this as us reporting on work in progress and raising issues and looking at who is represented here, who's here in this meeting. I'm sure you'll have questions and comments, and we very much value those. So do raise your hand at any point if you want to do that. And as quite a lot of you know, the Integrate custom is that you try not to let the speakers get through to the end of their slides because you have questions and comments. So please approach things in that spirit, and we will of course shut you down if you get really too annoying about it. Okay, right. So we're going to talk about what we're learning about policy and regulation as it applies in LEO. There's lots and lots of work being done on energy policy and regulation, of course, as you know. What we're trying to focus in on is how this relates to the experience of LEO, which has now been going for over 2 years, and also how to actually bring law into it. So not just regulation, but law. And Ted, who is actually a lawyer, will have something to say about that. So this is the menu, as it were, accompanied by a picture which you can interpret as you like. And if you're upbeat, you'll see that there's light at the end of the tunnel, and there's light in the tunnel, and there's a user-friendly mode of transport hinted at in the railway lines. And if you're not of an upbeat nature, you can interpret that in a wholly different way. But yes, down to the left, you can see what we're planning to talk about. Quick reminder about LEO to those of you who aren't already steeped in it. It is a very large-scale demonstrator project. It's the kind that only comes around very rarely, so it's tremendously valuable to be part of this. To be on a demonstrator project, real life, real time, involving lots of diverse people, and we have 4 years for it, which it was originally 3, but thanks to COVID, we have been funded for 4 years, which is certainly getting to be enough to be proof of concept, I think it's fair to say. We always thought that overall, getting to LEO sort of aims, we're talking about a 10-year time scale because of what's involved. But we do have a good chunk of time to get that started. And it's part funded by the UK Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. So it has some big government-related funding behind it, and it is part of a bigger program prospering from the energy revolution, which is a major program in this country. There is an associated large purely research program, Energy Rev. There's the Energy Rev something service that aims to draw out the findings and work on them from Energy Rev. I forget what the implementation possibly, a sort of support service, the Energy Rev. There's the Energy Systems Catapult that's involved, and there's also 2 other big demonstration projects going on, one of which is ESO, also based in Oxford, that Sam is involved in. And the concept is the smart local energy system. So it's technologically innovative. It's developing new forms of automation, and ICT is a core part of it. It's local, so it is geographically significant. It is It's a project where generation and other system assets are close to the people that they serve. It has a strong aim to be equitable so that people are not left behind in the course of transition, but there will be access to affordable energy services, and that we pay attention to the fact that as asset ownership becomes more and more important in an energy system, ownership of distributed assets, there's attention paid to the people who would not have the means to acquire those sort of assets. How are they going to benefit from a system like that? And it's environmentally sustainable. So it's about transition to net zero carbon. It doesn't really cover embodied energy, but it is, there is the carbon relationship, which is very important. And also I would say the resilience. So that it's sustainable in the sense that the system needs to be resilient to shocks and to change. And it has a history. So it's building on the work and experience of our network operator, Scottish and Southern Energy Networks, electricity networks, sorry, and the sort of challenges they're facing and the way they've been starting to address those. It builds very significantly, I think, on the work of the Low Carbon Hub, which is a social enterprise in Oxfordshire and has a lot of support within the county, which is it is able to engage with local communities and with individuals to get together the resources, the goodwill, the skills for low carbon transition. It works with the local councils as well. So there is the local authority support. And it's worth stating here, I think, that, or reminding you that all the local councils have declared climate emergency. So given that Oxfordshire is quite diverse politically, that is quite important. There is cross-party support for declaring climate emergency. They are now, of course, in the very challenging position of trying to work out what that means, having announced a climate emergency, how they're going to do something about it. And LEO specifically, as a proto-smart local energy system, is developing business models for a local and smart system. It's aiming for affordable energy services. It's a big part of LEO activity is trying to develop new local flexibility in energy markets. And we've now reached the stage halfway through of moving into some relatively large scale trials of this. These are just about to kick off. And from a network point of view, there is the continuing need to make the best use of the distributed generation we have in the county, which is increasing, the load, which is changing in nature. And of course, we're now moving into an era of more electric transport, more heating, more storage coming on, and the network assets that are available, developing them so that they're more capable of managing the situation. This is a network diagram of the sort of bodies that are involved in all this. And you can see how you can start seeing, I think, if you look at those, how the relationships between them won't always be the same sort. And to the bottom and the left, you would tend to see quite tight contractual relationships, whereas towards the top and the right, you would probably have looser forms of relationship. But you can see that there is the potential there for all sorts of legal issues arising between these different actors. And at that point, I will hand over to Ted. No, after this one, I will hand over to Ted. That's right. This is just a slide about how we went about doing the review. So we had, first of all, we asked our project partners, what sort of things do you think we should be looking at. And then we moved on from there. So starting from what had been actually identified by the project partners 2 years into the project, we then looked at legal material itself, we looked at some policy papers, and we looked at various reports and documents from the public sector and from the network operators, and a selection of NGOs, academics, and so on. And we drew on our own report from Leo too. And of all these things, we asked 4 questions which relate, as you'll see, to the actual aims of a smart local energy system. Now, this is not a comprehensive, systematic review, I have to say. This is what we were able to do in the time and with the resources available to us. So again, as I said in the beginning, this is work in progress. Now I really will hand over to Ted.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sarah, for that. And so what I will do is just put all this into context and just mention what the objectives of the review were. I cannot see myself very clearly, but I hope you can hear my voice. So this is the context of the review. Looking at the UK electricity market, the structure of the market initially did not contemplate smart local energy systems. And this then poses certain legal, policy, and regulatory problems. And if you go as far back as the late 80s, when unbundling of the electricity system was being done, a lot of the issues that we've covered or we're looking at today were not there. You know, when we talk about the 4 elements of smart local energy systems, a lot of that was not present, which therefore means that the regulatory framework for electricity was originally designed for a centralized system of power. Power here meaning electricity, not in other political sense. And so what that meant that there was fossil fuel dependence for heating and transport, largely oil and gas, and which means that a lot of the law, policy, and regulatory aspects of it went to that sector. However, with increased distributed supply, when you talk about energy storage and electrified heating and transport, what has then happened is that the system itself and the legal framework that regulates it are changing to adapt to these changes. And in the next slides, you'll see what exactly those changes are. But if you look at just those elements, you know, electrified heating and transport, distributed supply, storage, it means that if you look at, say, the Energy Act, between 2008 and 2013, there were a raft of changes that happened. There was the 2011 Energy Act, which then laid certain provisions to take into account some of these things. And in 2013, a lot of the elements that we discuss in this report today were put there: decarbonization, community energy, delegated powers to allow for greater regulation outside of Parliament, and so on. And so the energy system has had to change in how it functions, and the legal framework as well. Now, implementing a smart local energy system can only be achieved with policy and regulatory support. And this is one of the major findings that we came across, in the sense that smart local energy systems operate within this context. And therefore, there needs to be greater change to allow for more innovation. And therefore, law, policy, and regulation can be enablers or barriers to development of smart local energy systems. And the next few slides will demonstrate what some of the identified problems were, not just from a theoretical perspective, but from feedback from leo partners. So the objectives of our review were largely twofold. One, to describe how national, local law, policy, and regulation shape prospects for smart local energy systems, and basically bringing the law more fully into the picture. And this is quite important to tie into the previous point. More often than not, law is usually an afterthought, especially when we talk about innovation. the energy system evolves and then the law takes time to catch up. And the law usually is regimented and is quite slow in uptake, and just changing the law is slightly more difficult. And so the other objective of the review was not just to look at this from a legal or theoretical perspective, but to draw from our partners' experience with local law, policy and regulation, and just what are the pain points that they face in accelerating or adopting smart local energy systems. And so there was, a focus on those 4 elements of the smart local energy system, and looking at a transition-oriented project with emphasis on implementation. And there's a very nice quote there, which I will not read. I'll give you just a few seconds to have a look at, and then I'll move on to the next slide.
Ted, could you just say a bit about how you distinguish between law, policy and regulation, particularly law and regulation, because most regulations are set by people who under a law that I ask them to set a regulation. So
it's like you had a glimpse of my presentation, because on the next slide, because on the next slide, we have that distinction being made. And this is as far as generalizations go, to just simplify it. So law stems from legislation, which equals parliament, which means an act of parliament, a legislative act where it's the underpinning. This is the foundation of all this. That is public law. Then we have courts in this country. So we have common law where courts can actually lay down what the law is. And I can give an example or two of how that has affected energy systems. An example is the Tempest Energy case, which determined how electricity is traded. And that is the law, and it led to law reform. And this went all the way to the EU. I know we are in a post-Brexit world, but courts also are a source of law. On the private side, there are contracts, and then contracts are binding, but because they're binding, because they're founded on the law of contracts, which is a piece of legislation. And so private parties can actually voluntarily bind themselves to certain obligations. But generally speaking, when we speak about law, it stems from Parliament, which is what the courts will interpret and which is what private parties will privately contract within that framework. So the main actor is Parliament and courts and contracts, or broadly speaking. Policy stems, and some people may argue with this, and I'm happy to take questions on it, stems from politics. Politicians come up with their manifestos and government plans, which they then implement. And presently, governments are not changing as rapidly as people would like. But if you look at just how law, policy, and regulation are set, law is slightly more difficult to change. Policy is slightly less difficult to change, and regulation changes quite often. And so the main actor there is government or institutions. You can have policies in companies, but in this context, we're speaking about governments and therefore government policy. Regulation is delegated rule-making, what people call subsidiary legislation. And the main actor there is the executive or regulators. An example would be Ofgem or DEC or the minister. And if you look at the Energy Act, which I've mentioned, the 2013 Energy Act, one of the things that it did was give more powers for delegated rulemaking to allow changes within the energy system. Now, back to your question, Nick, a lot of people, when they speak of regulation, they speak of everything. They speak of the entire corpus of law, policy, and regulation as defined here. But I think that's a misnomer. Strictly speaking, regulation is what some people call subsidiary legislation, what Parliament has then delegated to other functions to do. And this is extremely important for energy systems and for smart local energy systems in particular, because regulation is more adaptable and easier to change than law. And there are quite a few examples in our report of things like, just transmission network charges, and so on. So what were the key takeaways? I'm not sure at what point, Sarah, well, thank you. So the key takeaways, the high level ones, are as follows. So this is the feedback we got. And the first one is that the instruments and tiers of law would be fees, and the tiers of law would be the different levels from international, national, regional, and local. There's a disjunction. They're not coordinated. And this poses a very serious problem because many of the elements that we speak on smart local energy systems are principle-based. If it's decarbonization will remain the same at international and up to local level. But if there's a disjunction within that chain, then we have a problem. I cannot see people online, so if anyone has a question, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask. The second thing for smart local energy systems is that this fragmentation is felt more strongly between national and local, at national and local level, where at national level we see, especially in terms of policy, almost the legacy of marquee large projects. Even when we speak about decarbonization, we're talking about hydrogen, offshore wind, nuclear. Yet at local level, and specifically for smart local energy systems, we're looking at storage, we're looking at delivering power as close, electricity as close to the people as possible. And so there's that as well. There's high level questions here, like there's unclear legal status for storage assets. So definitions here look at storage and they confuse or conflate them with generation, which means that it's more expensive for storage assets to accelerate, and the business case does not make sense. And this is acknowledged in the 2020 white paper, where the government has said, look, we need to have a legislative definition of storage to allow that to scale. We have data protection, competition and energy laws being siloed. So when, say, the GDPR was being formed, they did not have the energy industry in mind, or clearly smart local energy systems. Competition law looks at monopolies in general across the market, yet we know the energy industry is special in that sense. And therefore, one thing that needs to be done, especially from the energy law policy and regulation side, is to try and harmonize just how competition law and data protection works. And there is the example on data protection is the next point on the slide, where data sharing restrictions and commercial confidentiality obscure how energy systems should change. Specifically, say, for behind the meter technologies, or if energy equity targeted programs without getting precise data on who needs support and say what type of housing stock exists and so on. It's very difficult to make any practical or even law, policy and regulatory changes. So data sharing restrictions and commercial confidentiality were a particular problem. There was Brexit-related legislative and energy system realignment. Yes, Brexit is overarching, but we know that, look, our energy system is intertwined with the European energy system, and it's not clear how Brexit will affect smart local energy systems. But what we say is, because smart local energy systems are smaller systems, they are more susceptible to market shocks. And therefore, we are yet to see how that will unfold. And the structure of the electricity market and regulation can inhibit smart local energy systems. And this goes back to the centralized argument and how that needs to change. So I think at this point, I need to breathe a little.
Okay. And so at the intermediate level, again, we see this mismatch between. Sorry?
Sorry, that's our automated system at this end kicking in. Sorry.
Ooh.
Mute.
Okay. Right. Yes. So yes, at this point we come again to this mismatch between national direction and what's happening nationally and what's happening locally. And in terms of the big picture, in terms of meeting our climate goals, as the Climate Change Committee are pointing out quite forcefully now, a lot of the easy stuff has been achieved in this country already in terms of ceasing to burn coal in power stations. That's not by any means the only thing we've done to try and contain emissions, but it's the single largest thing. From now on in, it gets more complex, and what happens locally gets more and more important. And we can, we're certainly looking to that. And when you get to the 6th carbon budget, it becomes very clear, with the 6th carbon budget being the one that kicks in, I think it is in 2033. So just after the end of the sort of 10-year period we're thinking of in terms of LEO type activity, it becomes, this is where most of the action is going to be. And yet, there is not yet the sort of strategic direction to support local energy that we might be looking for. If you look at the recent energy white paper, it is very much around large scale generation, still focused on that. There is mention made of smart local energy systems, but not with any kind of level of detail or really much sense of understanding, I think. So there isn't yet the national strategic direction to support local energy that we might wish for. Although the indications are around the country that local councils are very much concerned about this and could do with some more support in developing local energy. I think over 300 of the local authorities now, for example, have proclaimed climate emergencies. So there are these serious sort of gaps between the policy proposals, because our country does have ambitious climate aims. Indeed, it's one of the world leading countries in that. And the actual mechanisms answering the sort of questions about how climate goals are actually achieved. We identified a strong voice from what we might call mainstream economics still in the policy documents. That sort of understanding of how the world operates, not entirely unrelated to that. It's separate, but I think somewhat related. The idea of energy equity, that people would have equitable access to energy services and would be able to take part in local energy systems in an equitable way, that's relatively inconspicuous in the documents that we saw. As you might expect, there is input from the Fuel Poverty Committee. They are mostly concerned at this stage, though, where energy is concerned, with people's ability to pay their bills as consumers. They're not yet really moving into the question of how energy systems will look, when it comes to people's ability to own assets that are part of those systems. Local councils are often concerned about fuel poverty in their area and often struggling to do anything adequate to address it in terms of improving the housing stock, providing energy advice and so on. So in these more complex market-based systems that we're envisaging with smart local energy systems, relying on distributed assets, there is the risk that new forms of unfairness get generated. And the work that's been done by the Centre for Sustainable Energy in Bristol, for example, did some modelling of all this, and they found, if we're looking ahead at the new world of smart local energy systems, the way things are at present, there's certainly going to be more capability of more affluent people and more urban people to take part in these systems and benefit from them than those who are less affluent and live in rural areas. So perhaps not too surprising, but there is some evidential backing building up for that. A market-based system will of course need regulation, and it will need new forms of regulation. The law is always perhaps struggling to catch up with developments in technology, new configurations of actors, new sort of processes and complexities. And one thing that certainly comes out is that the urgent need for energy planners and land use planners to be coordinated more, and for a development for local area energy planning. Hitherto, energy has often been quite an afterthought in the planning process. It's been entirely possible for a new development to be planned, even quite a large one. And then right at the end of it, when planning permission has been given, the local network says, okay, so, how are we going to connect all these people up? Oh, and by the way, it'll cost you an extra 2 million to do this, something of that sort. So local area energy planning comes out of this as a priority. But also there are other areas that need coordinating, I would say, better with energy planning. One of them being financial legislation, and what groups like the Low Carbon Hub are and are not permitted to do in terms of raising investment and investing in assets on behalf of their members. So I'll now hand back to Ted for the remainder. Yeah. Right.
So I'll try and quickly wrap up, but based on, so if you look at how this presentation is being made, and we started with the high level, which is almost like the law. What Sarah has just presented now is more on the policy. And then this is almost more granular, more detailed, and almost touching on the regulation and feedback from Leo partners. So smart local energy system issues can be financial, legal, or organizational, which therefore means that the answers do not particularly just lie with law, policy, and regulation. So there needs to be some form of coordination between various actors in energy systems. But law, policy, and regulation are tools that will facilitate this or hinder this transition to smart local energy systems. And so the other problem that we see, and this ties in with the disconnect between the various tiers, is that there's local variability in resourcing, technical capacity, net zero ambition, planning, and so on. And from the plans that we had a look at, each municipality or local authority seemed to have their own different plans, and they had different resourcing for these plans. And so this local variability is something that needs to be contemplated, because there are contextual differences in each of these regions. Also, regulation for new distributed assets needs to be compatible with local planning, which picks up on what Sarah was talking about in the previous slide. Local planning needs to either be better coordinated or needs, at national level, there needs to be a contemplation of the variability that we're talking about. And so when we speak about especially regulation for distributed assets, these will be deployed at the local level, and therefore local planning, whether we're looking at building stock and so on, needs to be taken into account. One of the takeaways is that there's inadequate policy support, there's insufficient finance, and there's a lack of planning tools for building retrofit as compared to new builds. So what happens to retrofitting existing stock, whether it's housing stock or buildings, to match the ambitions or the plans of smart local energy systems? There seems to be a gap there. There's also metering and monitoring data that is either not shared or underutilized or inaccessible. And this takes us back to the data protection questions and just how the smart meter rollout needs to happen. And so this was one, which is actually the next point. So we need to mobilize smart data in the public interest with appropriate privacy and security concerns taken into account. There's also the need for prompt completion of the smart meter rollout, which will then generate the data that is necessary, and access to that data to allow for acceleration of adoption of smart local energy systems. So this was a word cloud that I, picked from just what were the key words, and it was quite interesting because in as much as I, Nick, Sarah and I, prepared this report, I did not think that some of the issues that I thought were more serious would be that minuscule in the word cloud. Energy featured a lot, smart local energy systems featured a lot, law was tiny. In fact, it took time for me to find where law was. Electricity was tiny. We're talking about, energy systems. So electricity wasn't mentioned as often as I thought. Thankfully, carbon was small. Sustainability, I thought, would be huge. It did not appear. And so sometimes just picking some of these, using technology to just see what's coming out, says a lot about why also human intervention is necessary. Because if this were an interview panel and there were keywords, probably our CV would not go through. So based on this word cloud, and I mean, it's really important, especially at local level, for engagement of the different actors. And so we also ask you to engage with our report and just basically engage in this process. So you have somewhat failed in the clarion call that Sarah made, because I'm getting to the conclusion now. And the ABCs of our conclusion are that, and this is a good point, that the UK is ambitious. The plans, whether we're looking at net zero by 2050, whether we look at some of the milestones at 2035, 2033, rollout of EVs and so on, the ambition is high. However, there's a mismatch between these high ambitions for a decarbonized and equitable energy system and implementation mechanisms and the more granular detail. So if you look at national policy, it lays all these huge plans. But if you look at the local level, how that is going to be deployed, it's lacking in detail. And so law, policy, and regulation, of course, need greater interaction for deployment and to just basically achieve these high ambitions. There seems, and I should have changed that part, there's a breakdown. There are high levels of disagreement. Okay, agreement needed. Oh, I changed that. Wonderful. High levels of agreement are needed on policy goals between national and local planning documents. So what we saw, there's a disaggregation between national planning and local planning. There's a mismatch between national budgets and local finance that's available. There's a gap in law between procurement of, say, smart local energy systems and just procurement processes at local level and what's happening at national level. And the C is collaboration, and it's impossible to achieve these high ambitions and have these greater agreements without law, policy, and regulation. It's broad. When you compare that with energy, finance, governance, different actors and documents. So there's a lot of work that needs to be put into place, and no single entity can do this. I mean, it became very clear very quickly to us, just the enormity of the task that had been set for this policy review. And so I think everybody needs to be involved in this, and greater collaboration is needed. I think I will stop there and invite Sarah and comments and anybody else to intervene on this stage. So I'll stand here uncomfortably until someone, yes.
May I ask a question about the old days when there was municipal supply of town gas, electricity, water, local authorities ran trolley buses, this kind of thing? Is there any legislation, policy that could be mined, in other words, reused from the days when there were local owned assets, or has that all been revoked? So can we pick up some of the positives from that?
That is a brilliant question. I think that would need law reform, because, and anybody on the call, feel free to say this, because what generally happens, I'll give the example of the Energy Act, for example. The 2008 Act technically does not exist anymore because it's been superseded by the 2011 and the now existing 2013 Act. And so once the legal basis changes, the structure changes. So there's room, I think, to revisit the good things from the good old days and have law reform. I think that's the answer I'd give. That's the short answer. I think there are debates on whether even unbundling, as it was contemplated in 1989, is fit for purpose now. And so there are certain things from those days that would be necessary to revive, but I think it would need law reform. And if anyone has a different answer, feel free to correct. Yeah.
Yes, it's maybe a related question, but I mean, the term comes up quite often, local area energy planning. Increasingly, I worry that there isn't really an understanding, that nobody really has an understanding of what this means, or perhaps that there are two different ones. Because there are two very different traditions it seems to be drawing. One is land use planning, which is local area based, geographically based, and the other is energy planning, which is generally nothing to do with that. It's about how much supply is, how much demand is, and what are the networks, and what are the flows between those. And if you ask the land use planner to project the flows of electricity on the SLES system, you wouldn't get very far. I mean, there's a complete disconnect. So how do you, I mean, everybody says, look, well, we need local area energy plans, and it's easy to say, yeah, we need local area, we did, but what are they, and who does that? Right?
It's maybe worth saying something at this point about what's been an important part of LEO, which has been the mapping work.
Yeah.
So Rajat Gupta and colleagues at Brooks has been working with the County Council, and they've done an enormous mapping exercise now, so that you can overlay, where the energy assets are around the county, where the potential energy assets are, where are the places where people have off-street parking for electric vehicles, where they've got roofs for solar, all this kind of thing. And so you are getting a much, much richer data set now for planning that brings together energy and land use. So that's actually been a very important part of LEO. So I think that is moving forward.
And presumably SSEN are involved in that, and maybe even SGN as well.
I'm not sure how much they're involved to some extent. I don't know, I couldn't tell you directly.
They do the physical flow.
And certainly it's part of the energy systems catapults work to develop this thing, which now has capital letters, local area energy planning. So I'm, I would say it's really on the radar now, and there is work underway for it. But yes, I mean, I think your points are still things to watch out for. Jacob, I think, had his hand up, but maybe he's decided. Maybe he's decided. Jake.
Hello, Sarah. I was giving a little clap, but since I'm now on air.
Go for it.
No, I found that really interesting, definitely. But it also there's a bit of conceptual confusion on my part, and that's around the different levels in the way that you presented the work. Law being high, policy intermediate, and regulation being detailed rather than low, and it's not quite clear to me why they're positioned where they are, and it makes me think of the work on policy mixes, which generally takes the view that the policy is the ambition, high level stuff, and then they talk about instruments that you use, which may include laws, regulations, programs, all the kind of various instruments, and then looking at the coherence between them, or the consistency in how they evolve over time. That's just a reflection. Yeah. My question, I guess, is based on this, how do you go about changing those different elements from a LEO perspective? And in part, that's because it seemed to be presented in a top-down way, cascading down to the local level. But LEO is very local, and do you then kind of try and feed back up? Or do you go straight to the top and try and change at the top and cascade down?
So kind of in terms of Ted's three cogs, yes, which cog would you go for to try and turn the other? And for example, if you change the regulations, will that have an upstream effect eventually on law? That's the kind of thing, is it? Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. In part, what do you do with this information next if we want to support Leo and the development of smart local energy systems?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and I'm going to hand it to Ted, I think, because it's if you don't think that's me, because
No, that's all right. So I need to move over there somewhere.
Yeah.
That's good, apparently. So on the intermediate part, that was a presentation on the findings. It wasn't on the positioning of law, policy, and regulation. So the part where on the slides, and I'll just go back to them so that it's the key takeaways. So these were high-level takeaways, and intermediate takeaways and detailed. So it wasn't really saying that policy is not high level, because policy can be actually quite high level and regulation is more granular. So on that point, that's taken. On the second point of how these interact, I think the more important thing is for the legal underpinning, for the legislation, to allow changes without making the process onerous. So I think that Energy Act does allow for this. Now, it's just a question of the policy part. How do we then involve ourselves in the regulation? Because at least in the UK, there's a good tradition of engagement, like I see Ofgem and BAYS, calling for participation before changes are made. I think greater participation in that is important, but we cannot move away from finance, because I think at local level planning, a lot of it boils down to how much money do these local authorities have to do their planning and to implement. Back to Nick's question on local area planning. This, from a legal perspective, this is really interesting, and it's playing out in other parts of the world. Because when you speak about infrastructure, it has to be on some form of land. And so land use becomes quite important. When you're talking about smart local energy systems, you're talking about property. And there are certain regulations now, and it's somewhere I think in our report, where if you improve the value of your property, it has a knock-on effect on how you can sell, what sort of surveys can be done and reports that are needed and so on. So I think there's need to blend these together. And of course, land use planners have no idea about the more technical stuff about electricity. So that's a point that's taken, and I genuinely do not know how that can be solved other than fusing these processes and making them seamless and easy. And maybe the community health bill and act or local energy bill should address this, but I doubt it's good. There's a question by Nick Banks, I think.
Oh, hi. Yeah. So, to Jake's point about what does all this tell us about how to make changes, demonstrated through Leo, and also Nick's question about local area energy plans and sort of what are they and who owns them? Well, local authorities are kind of right in the crosshairs for this. I mean, this is something that local authorities should be owning, this whole agenda, including development of the local area energy plans. But what we've found when we've sort of workshopped this, particularly around the sort of planning side of things, is that local authorities only really have dominion over new development, new housing, transport systems, ensuring that the planning rules are adhered to in conservation areas, and also their own sort of buildings and housing stocks. So the whole sort of area of how we kind of retrofit existing buildings and existing housing is kind of, they don't really have powers over that. And it's just left to sort of rather general kind of policy statements in their local plans. And the development of kind of strategies, sometimes backed by grant funding, but often not. And, where that grant funding does arrive, it's often, stopped shortly after. There's a sort of stop-start nature to grant funding, which is a real issue with all of this. So bearing in mind what Ted was saying about, it's law that's difficult to change. And, if you really want to sort of embed and kind of drive change through the system, it has to be kind of rooted in law. I think there's a good case for, developing law, something like, the smart local energy systems law that will apply to local authorities and give them new powers and new duties to for example, coordinate retrofit activities in existing housing stocks and in existing buildings to make them suitable for providing flex services into smart local energy markets. So we need a smart local energy systems law. That's what I'm trying to say.
I support that. Thanks, Nick. I think Thomas has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed the presentation because in a kind of, because I've also been kind of increasingly thinking about some of these issues because we've started interacting with BEIS on our market design project within Energy Rev. And also we've had kind of broader discussions with different groups that seem kind of interested in the potential for large or small kind of market reforms like in the UK. But the process for that, I guess, is still a bit unclear. So I was sort of interested in what you're talking about the kind of market arrangements and then these changes that could be, through regulation versus through law, and also the interaction between BEIS and Ofgem, I guess, in particular. So I suppose the kind of question is what you think in terms of like, is the path forward more like incremental changes to regulation and law, or is it more like a bunch of groups getting together and realizing that there needs to be a large change to market design that involves multiple elements, and which one of those is kind of more realistic? And yeah.
I think what we're most likely to see, Thomas, probably is incremental change, and certainly quite a lot can be done through that. But when it comes to what is really needed, I think, if anything, I'd go beyond what Nick Banks was saying, say we need a fairly fundamental rethink about who does what in this country and the relationship between central policy and local policy and action, and having the funds available to local actors so that they can actually achieve the sort of ambition that's set out in the Climate Change Act and is in the carbon budgets that are coming up.
Yeah, because one of the challenges, I think that, I mean, even within BEIS, what I've kind of realized is that there's lots of different groups that are responsible for different things, and then BEIS is only one participant, right? So I guess one of the challenges you get to with this kind of incremental changes is that as you said, if you're thinking about kind of figuring out how should the responsibilities be kind of reassigned or things be simplified, it's quite difficult to do that by making small changes one at a time, kind of, yeah. I guess, because it tends to make things more and more complicated in a way. That's, I guess, the only challenge. But yeah, I mean, maybe we should discuss this further, but it's a very interesting issue.
We probably have time for one more question.
Yes.
Colin, did you want to launch in?
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. Are you basically calling for something akin to German-style Stadtwerke, so regional or municipal utilities that can capture rents from local energy generation as well as distribution and sale?
Could you just say a little more about that, Colin?
So in the German model, where you often have, or at least in the past, before neoliberalization, you had local utilities, which
Yes.
are energy generation, distribution, and sale. So which obviously runs contrary to the supplier hub model in the UK, but it enables a lot more local power over all these different systems. So is it actually possible to implement smart local energy systems without such a degree of local control?
I'm not sure. I think there's a lot to be said for that old style German city-state type arrangement. And indeed, Oxfordshire is quite a nice example of an English city-state, you might say. And as such, it's probably quite a good test bed.
Just a quick point. I mean, that's probably made difficult in Europe by the legislation because it was based on British liberalisation legislation.
Yes.
So I would always hesitate before saying the upside of Brexit. But actually, we are now free of the British legislation that we foisted on the rest of Europe.
Yes, and I think the German cities, municipalities, in fact, they lost a lot of powers, didn't they, through that process? Yes, but we could now actually start to reclaim them, that sort of thing. And, you know, given if we want a well-functioning accountable energy system for the future, that might well be the way to go.
Yes, and for coordination as well, because South Africa has a similar sort of system, but it's not working particularly well at all. And so the points we've made about just greater collaboration and resourcing would be fundamental, but I think there's a lot of positives from the German system and their Energiewende as well, because it's also focused on the transition. I think I shall hand over and thank you very much for your time.